Y'all know how weird this game is, right? I can't be the only one who sees how weird this is. Stop and think about it for a second. You've got a handful of Mario characters running around pulling vegetables and other items out of the ground and then throwing them on enemies, along with magic carpets, ninjas, bombs, rocket ships, creepy masks that chase you, bird-like creatures that shoot eggs out of their faces, and each level ends with you walking into an eagle's mouth after picking up a gem. And don't give me that, oh, well, Mario's just having a dream, that's why it's so weird nonsense either, because from a mechanical standpoint, this game is just as strange. After all, this is the sequel to Super Mario Bros., a linear game that was built primarily around tight platforming, enemy hopping, and weaving yourself in and out of a myriad of traps and hurdles. Yet Super Mario Bros. 2 eschews most of that in favor of grabbing stuff. Yep. Whereas before, you dispatch enemies simply by jumping onto their heads, now you can only defeat them by jumping on them, stopping, picking them up, and then throwing them, and oh, wait. You jump on them, stop, pick them up, and then throw them into another enemy or down a pit to finally defeat them. Ugh. It doesn't sound like this small change would make that big of a difference, but in practice, it really has the effect of slowing the pace of the game down quite a bit. But I suppose that's fine, given that there isn't a time limit anymore and the levels are designed more around exploration than linear platforming, so at the very least, the combat mechanics and the way you interact with the world are consistent with the type of experience the game is trying to deliver. It's just that, I don't know, something about this game just feels off to me, and it always has. Every time I've sat down to play it, I've found myself feeling either bored or worse, frustrated, like I was constantly fighting with the very mechanics that make the game unique. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I've never liked this game, so much so that I've been unable to stick with it long enough to even finish it. Now, don't get me wrong, I recognize that it's a classic and that everyone else in the world seems to think it's a phenomenal game, but I also get the feeling that a lot of what people love about this game has to do with how they were exposed to it, rather than what the game actually is. Or at least that's how I used to see it. Foreshadowing. Try to imagine, or maybe just remember, depending on whom you are, what it was like to be a young gamer with an NES growing up in the late 80s and early 90s. And for the sake of argument, let's say that your favorite game for this system was Super Mario Bros. You've played Zelda, you've played Metroid, you've played Kid Icarus, and all the other mainline Nintendo games, yet all you really wanted was a sequel to your favorite game. And then, finally, after years of waiting, you get this. Here we have a game that, compared to its predecessor, had much better graphics, much better music, much more variety, and, depending on whom you ask, much better gameplay. Would you be disappointed that it was so different and so much weirder than its predecessor? I'd wager no. For one thing, video games were still a pretty new medium at the time, and the video game crash of North America single-handedly caused the game-buying public to be leery of sequels that didn't greatly improve on their predecessors or take the series in a new direction entirely. And this was Nintendo of America's reasoning for why the West saw neither hide nor hair of the real Super Mario Bros. 2 until much later. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with the details here, since by now it's common knowledge that the Super Mario Bros. 2 we got here in the West was just a modified version of another Nintendo game called Yume Kojo Doki Panic, and that the original Super Mario Bros. 2 was kept in Japan until it eventually showed up in the Super Nintendo Collection Super Mario All-Stars under the title The Lost Levels. Did you get all that? Though for a better recap of this unique story of video game history, I'd highly recommend the Gaming Historian's excellent video on this very subject, link in the description. So knowing all that, I imagine that the Super Mario Bros. 2 we did get was quite the pleasant experience for the majority of players of the time, players who almost certainly didn't even bat an eye at how different and weird it really was. But for me, it's always been the black sheep of the Mario franchise, and I've never been able to see what all the fuss was about. And to be honest, I downright hated this game when I first played it, just due to how different it was. The slower pace of the game and what I consider to be awful combat controls were a jarring experience for me, as I was so used to the way Mario moved about in Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World. Then there's the fact that this game practically requires a certain amount of guesswork or memorization, which, to be fair, so did practically every other game from the era, but I'd argue that this guesswork and memorization is so much more problematic in this game due simply to the amount of variety brought about by the different characters. And in that regard, I always did like the idea of each character having different abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, and I especially like that you can swap between them after each level, but because I was never patient enough to take the time to memorize the layout of each world and the locations of items, I always felt like choosing a character was based less on strategy and more on luck. Like, alright, I remember this level is primarily side-scrolling, so I guess I'll go with Mario, but oh shit, there's a bunch of quicksand. Wish I would've chose Peach or Luigi so I can jump over it. That's alright, I guess I'll choose them for the next level, and shit, now there's a whole bunch of sand that I need to pull up while dodging Shy Guys and other enemies. Sure wish I had Toad. In Doki Panic, the character choices made a lot lot more sense since each character acted primarily as their own separate save slot, meaning that when you swapped characters, you couldn't actually continue on from where another character left off, but instead had to start over from the beginning. On the one hand, this kinda sucks and is a cheap way to extend the length of the game, but on the other hand, you didn't have the guesswork and memorization of trying to determine which character was the best fit for each level, since you were forced to play through every level with each character anyway. By designing the game this way, the abilities of each character and their individual strengths and weaknesses affected the presentation of the levels, giving each playthrough its own unique feel, along with some minor changes in the route you take through each level and world, similar to how Sonic 3 and Knuckles approached its characters and save system a few years later. But in Super Mario Bros. 2, it all comes down to a gigantic guessing game, or at the very least a case of choosing the one character you like playing the most and ignoring all the others, which from what I've seen is how most people play this game anyway, making the ability to swap characters between levels yet another primarily useless mechanic. So looking back, especially from the perspective of someone who didn't experience the game when it was new, I'd say it's pretty obvious that something was up, that the tight design of the original game was gone in favor of a flashier, more gimmicky experience. And that's always been this game in a nutshell for me. Much like the original Super Mario Bros., I didn't grow up with Super Mario Bros. 2, and unlike the original, I didn't even get to play it as a kid. In fact, it wasn't until about 10 or so years ago when I started hanging around the old Screw Attack forums that I even became aware of this game's existence from a user-posted video that was more or less about how Nintendo pulled the wool over everyone's eyes by repurposing Doki Doki Panic. I wish I could say that this blew my mind or that there was some interesting level of fate happening right here, but really my reaction was just,
"That's fucking interesting, man. That's fucking interesting."
Now, I imagine a great deal of people who grew up with this game have been quite surprised by this information, to suddenly find out that a beloved game from their childhood wasn't exactly what they thought it was. But because this is how I was exposed to both the Western Super Mario Bros. 2 as well as Doki Doki Panic, to me it never really came as that much of a surprise, and to this day I have a hard time reconciling this as an actual addition to the Mario franchise. The two games are so intricately linked in my mind that I'm unable to separate them even if I try. This, combined with levels and gameplay that were always just too slow and methodical for my tastes, has made it really difficult for me to see what all the fuss is about, to see why people enjoy this game so much. By the time I finally got around to playing Super Mario Bros. 2, I was so familiar with the 2D Mario formula and so aware of the game's history that I've never been able to enjoy it as a Mario game. In fact, I've always kind of thought of it as an official Nintendo ROM hack, which is pretty much what it is, and this is probably why I've never taken the time to beat it either. I just couldn't bring myself to keep going in a game that was so strangely inconsistent with itself. My point here is that the way we're first introduced to a game, or any piece of artwork for that matter, will undoubtedly color the perception we have of it. All of this is to say that I fully expected to sit down and play Super Mario Bros. 2 for this critique and get hung up on that same feeling before proceeding to explain why I personally dislike the game. After all, I've been trying my damnedest to like it for 10 solid years now, and each time I've played it, I've only gotten frustrated and quit just a handful of levels in. But I wanted to review it, so I sat down to play, and I'm not really sure why, but somehow I finally managed to see what makes this game so special for so many people. For some reason, this time around I didn't find the guesswork and memorization I mentioned just moments ago to be all that bad, and to be honest, I'm not really sure why it was such a big deal to me in the first place. Maybe it's because this time I decided to stick with Mario and not worry about finding the best character for each situation while spending less time trying to find mushrooms to power him up and just focus on completing each level. Or maybe it was because I deliberately avoided every enemy I could rather than trying to take them out like in Super Mario Bros., viewing them more as stage hazards and platforms than the enemies that they actually are. Whatever the case, Super Mario Bros. 2 finally left an impression on me that wasn't the boredom and frustration I typically walked away with. And furthermore, my impression was not only that the game is an overall positive experience, but that it's quite exceptional. In a single playthrough, I went from somewhat disliking the game to absolutely adoring it. In fact, I dare say I've come to love it even more than the original, possibly even more than Super Mario Bros. 3, but I guess we'll find that out when I finally get around to reviewing that one. Now, does this mean that I suddenly think it's perfect? Well, no, I still think there are a lot of bullshit moments, like having to check every pot in 6-1 to find the key to the seemingly endless castle in 3-3, or that each item you throw has a different arc based on your movement, which character you're using, and which item you are, in fact, throwing.
For these goddamn sand areas! Ugh!
But for the most part, this game is a ton of fun, and I'm glad that I can finally enjoy it after years of trying. Though this begs the question, what changed? Why do I suddenly have an affinity for this game when I've always sort of disliked it? I mean, I've had plenty of experiences where a game I used to love suddenly stops being enjoyable to me and I come to hate it, but I can't say I've ever had the experience of disliking a game and then eventually coming to love it, at least not to this degree. So again, what changed? Well, I can't be sure, but I do do have a couple of hypotheses. The first is that the idea of a Mario formula isn't as much of a thing as it used to be. Back when I first heard of Super Mario Bros. 2, we really only had 2D Mario games and 3D Mario games. Sure, there were a few spin-offs and sports titles and party games and RPGs, but not quite to the degree that we have today, or at least those titles weren't as popular as they are today. And more importantly, I personally hadn't played any of these spin-offs, so my perception of what makes a Mario game basically just boiled down to games like this and games like this. But now that I'm much more familiar with the series at large and have taken the time to play some of the plumber's lesser known titles, Super Mario Bros. 2 seems much more in line with the rest of the series to me. This is of course helped by the fact that much of what makes a Mario game just happened to get its start in this strange second iteration. The now iconic Bob-ombs, Shy Guys, Sniffits, Pokies, and Birdos all started out in Doki Doki Panic / Super Mario Bros. 2, but now they're inseparable from the Mario series, so the fact that they actually got their start in a different game is of little relevance. Super Mario Bros. 2 also set the now iconic looks of Mario, Luigi, Toad, and Peach, designs that haven't really changed all that much to this very day. So to say that Super Mario Bros. 2 isn't a real Mario game, given how much it's impacted the series over the years, is a bit silly. In fact, Nintendo must have thought so too, because in 1992 they re-released the game in Japan as Super Mario Bros. USA, finally cementing it as a true Mario title in both Japan as well as the West. And hell, if you go to Google Japan and type in Super Mario Bros. 2, look what comes up first. It isn't the quote-unquote real sequel, but the Super Mario Bros. 2 that's now recognized the world over as being a great entry to the Mario series. But more importantly than all that, I've changed. I've matured, or at least I like to think I have, and my taste and expectations of games have changed as well. When I first played Super Mario Bros. 2, I found it to be too slow and methodical of a time that, along with my preconceptions of it, caused me to write it off as a lazy addition to the Mario franchise. But nowadays I play a game like this and I can't help but appreciate its pace, as I've sort of become burnt out on games that try to be never-ending thrill rides. And I think that's just part of growing up as well. 10 years ago I craved action and moment-to-moment challenge, but now that I'm an adult who's pushing 30 years of age, I've lived through moments of constant stress, adrenaline-pumping challenges, and hardships my 18-year-old self couldn't even imagine, as well as what it's like to give something your all and still come up short. And because of this, I'm much more able to appreciate a work of art that takes things at a slower pace. In fact, in a lot of cases, I crave a slower pace. Time moves fast, and it only moves faster with each passing year, so to have a game that says, hey bro, why don't you slow down a bit, relax, put your feet up, and stay a while, is something that I've really come to appreciate. And Super Mario Bros. 2 provides that kind of experience. It's slow enough that you can take your time and relax, but it's also fast enough and challenging enough that you never get bored, and I love it for that. Combine this with its quirky world, excellent 8-bit graphics, and a timeless soundtrack, and Super Mario Bros. 2 is a game that has proven to me, yet again, just how important this medium is, and why it's so important to analyze games through a critical lens, and that how we experience a game matters just as much as how the game is constructed. Criticism in and of itself is an art, not a science. There is no objective measure of a quality game because different games are going to appeal to different people at different points in their lives based on the experiences they've had and their personal history with the medium. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if a game's good or bad. What matters is how it affected you personally, and more importantly, why it affected you the way it did. And Super Mario Bros. 2 is probably the only game I can think of that has affected me in such a wide variety of ways based only on how far along in my personal journey I was at the time I played it. It's a game that I've gone from hating to being apathetic about, and now it's settled in as a game that I absolutely adore, becoming easily one of my favorite games of the era, and certainly one of my favorite entries in a series that I've come to love just as much. Super Mario Bros. 2 is more than just a classic, but probably the most important milestone for the Mario series, and a landmark title for the entire medium. And I'm glad I can finally see how great it really is.